We're just waiting for everyone else to trickle in. I'll just reply all to this email. Okay, is everyone back? Yeah, this looks like everyone. Okay. So, did everyone get the stuff I was talking about why it's not reductionary and why the Klein evidence doesn't apply? Because I've seen that read in a lot of debates, and I just have been increasingly frustrated because I just don't think it applies. Okay, so we finished seduction of isolated terror. Cool. And I guess this part that I'm getting to now will also be a response to the Klein evidence, because the Klein evidence will never actually say that state reformism isn't good in order to challenge anti-blackness. Our argument is that a theory of reformism crowds out other movements that are a lot more. Ooh, who are we waiting for? Hari. Cool. Okay, Hari's back. So our argument is that a theory of reformism crowds out other movements. It's a method of control and a rhetorical construct that delimits the possibility of resistance. So that quote I got from Calvin Warren's Black Nihilism. I think it's a really, really good read that anyone interested in Afropessimism should take a look at. But the argument that Warren is making is twofold. One is that this will be a link to the affirmative, right? That when we understand reformism, it prevents us, it results in the policing of other communities. And I think an example of this is the distinction between Black Lives Matter movement and the Assata's Daughters movement, right? Where after Eric Gardner's shooting and killing, what happened was there were a series of cop killings held across the nation, and the question of reformism versus extra legal movements became really, really important. Assata's daughters, although not engaging in the cop killings, were saying that, hey, it's time for us to revolt, take to the street, do extra legal action. And BLM said, hey, you can do that too, but alongside with our sort of, reformism or tempered strategy. The problem was when those two movements sort of connected together and worked together, there was massive amount of dissent in the group. And it resulted in the pathologization of the people that wanted to engage in extra legal activism. I think you can see this really clearly in the way the media has portrayed sort of the violent protesters as the looters and versus the good protesters as the peaceful who are peacefully protesting. Reformism delimits the idea of protest to be only through nonviolent means in order to demand reform, but never is sort of about the sort of a grounding antagonism and challenging. It delimits the idea and the way for us to protest. Nor I'll spell the name here. Assata's daughters. Let me just make sure I spelled that right. Assata's. Yeah. Okay, Nora, I just sent it in the chat. That's how you spell it. So that sort of movement and the way that those movements get pathologized, and then we understand what is the good movement versus the bad movement, is a way that sort of delimits reform, that pathologizes and prevents the ability for movements outside of the state. And if we win that the state in itself is not very efficacious, then that is then a disad to their whatever. I also think this implicates the affirmative on the level of framework. The move to be, we should have discussions purely about policy analysis instead of about rhetoric, representations, etc., is sus at best because it prevents us from understanding alternative methods of protest. The Warren evidence is actually surprisingly good about why there is a dominant epistemology in academia about why reformism is super duper important. But the problem is that we're unable to think of new means of resistance outside of the state because we have been told that the state is things such as inevitable and it's the only method for us to do effective protest through. This is part of the reason why Warren articulates that outside of academia, extra legal movements do get pathologized because we are taught that those movements are not the correct method of protests. The crowding out of those movements is bad and results in crackdowns on them, which means that their interpretation at best results in the next form of the PRL and community policing. Our argument is that rather than delimiting the possibilities to be solely about the political, a refusal of that breaks that epistemological cycle and forces people to come to grips with alternative modes of living that creates the ability for communities of care to arise here in the wake of debate. I may have cut out for that, but did everyone understand that part? About communities of care, critique of only political on the level of framework. Okay. I want to take a pause here. Anyone have any questions before we keep going? Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? Okay. So then I'll move on to the next argument, which is on. So which other modes of reform do you think Nietzsche warned? Adarsh, can you, what do you mean with other modes of reform? I think that sort of Warren has forwarded a critique of reformism. I think Nietzsche plus Warren could work together, but I would try to keep it separate just because I think that Warren also offers a critique of Nietzsche, and I don't think that I think that we should probably defer to Black authors' interpretations of Nietzsche instead of reading Nietzsche's original source, because the whole point of Warren is that he has retooled Nietzsche to be against the academy, and it's not the original statement. But I mean, I think some stuff about the will to power might be fine, but I don't know. I think that'll get too muddled up, and I think you'll lose a very, very important part of the topic that's focusing around Warren, right? Warren's whole premise is that he has moved the academy away from Nietzsche and offering a different interpretation for the academy to interpolate. Yeah. Yeah, I would rather just read Warren. And I also think that Warren speaks in a more simple language than Nietzsche, and it's just easier for people to understand and debate too. Cool. So the second to last thing I have on the problem with reformism is on the level of grammar. So reformism this is more of a framework question than an implication of the AF question, because I think this question begs how, if we are living in a world that has been proliferated by anti-Black grammars, how are we able to create new methods of understanding or experience that are able to challenge those systems of anti-Blackness? The argument that authors will make, especially Warren and people that advocate for things like refusal, such as Gums, will make, is that we need to create a sort of break from the normative regime of grammar and the repetition of such in order to create new modes of experience and new ways to communicate that experience. If we go back to the stuff we talked about at the beginning, right, about the libidinal economy and things happen for a reason that are unexplainable, then how do we go about reformism? Or how do we even go about movement building? Or how do we even go about surviving? These are all questions that Afropessimists have questioned and posed the question of in the context of reformism. I think a really good piece of evidence that articulates this is the Douglas evidence. If people haven't seen this, I can send this out after the stream. But the thesis of the card is that when he was originally taught in school about reformism and things such as, you can engage in political activism and you can change stuff. When he was engaged in those movements, he realized that Black folks were not treated with the same rights that white folks did, even though they would be viewed as equal under the law. Uh, there was still a distinction in the way the movements broke down because the movements were still had parasitic relationships with one another, but he was unable to articulate why that was happening or how he could explain that outside of an Afro-pessimist lens. Afro-pessimism then provides a grammatical framework for understanding regimes of violence and allowing for other sort of, I hesitate to say the word activism because I think Afro-pessimists would be against activism, but new modes of sociality and spiritual life to emerge in its wake. So the production of an accurate grammar or an accurate explanatory power is then important and is the job of the Afro-pessimists in order for us to, create a different relationship to the way that violence operates and how to mitigate stuff. Does that all make sense? Cool. And I think this will also answer a lot of the arguments that teams will make about like, oh my God, you're too flattening. You prevent anything from ever happening. You just tell people to sit back and do nothing. Uh, the argument is no. A refusal of grammar is sort of, I don't want to say productive, but does have an impact because it is able to challenge the way that the proliferation of grammars happen, right? So if we go back to the way we phrase the fluidity and fungibility claim at the beginning, it's a byproduct of this repetition of grammars. Therefore, only through a refusal of the repetition of such grammars are we able to create an impasse that something else can emerge. Only through a sort of recognition that reformism is folly and reformism does not have any efficacious results can that create the moment for other places of care and community to arise. Cool. Uh, the last stuff I have with the last stuff I'm going to talk about with reformism before I open up to just questions, thoughts, concerns, and we can just have a discussion for however long it lasts, is the idea of cruel optimism, right? And I saved this one for last because this one is the most trite and I've heard it so many times over and over again in debate. And I think most people understand it. But the argument that it's fundamentally saying is because of everything that we've talked about above, right? Even if reform happens, it is never efficacious. It never changes anything. And it results in a repetition of the status quo. Therefore, forwarding a faith in that system is a form of cruel optimism that results in psychic violence against Black folks. The Warren evidence, I think, is what starts the claim about cruel optimism. But Sullivan, who I think was the person overseeing Warren when he wrote Ontological Terror, wrote another article that sort of has a bunch of psychological studies about why that is true. I think this is probably the most useful impact claim in the debate round because I think fungibility is an impact, but I think a lot of judges find it difficult to conceptualize what an impact is to fungibility because, right, of the whole grid grammar thing, it breaks down the ability for us to distinguish what is like us versus them. That whole stuff is why it gets sort of muddled up in debates. But I think cruel optimism functions as a really easy external impact that you can articulate as a disad to their politics. I think cruel optimism also has an interesting way that it could spin out that teams haven't been interested in. I think it impact turns when teams just list a bunch of reforms that have happened in the past and they're like, therefore progress possible, AF is a good idea. because it says the sort of why like why is the AF the same thing as abolishing slavery? Why is the AF the same thing as X reformism, X example of reform? Those questions and cross-checks are really difficult for the affirmative team to answer because the affirmative team is oftentimes not nearly as radical as the examples that they give. So the move to say that those past instances of progress is a justification for why the plan is a good instance of progress is then another form of cruel optimism, if that makes sense. Cool. So I think I've gone through sort of my sort of core stuff that I wanted to get through. So I'm going to open it up for just like thoughts, discussions. Feel free to come off mute. Feel free to talk about this. I think there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about more that I can go more in depth into, but this is just sort of the basic overview of the Afro-pessimist critique of reformism. So Sandy said, what if the AF team just uses those past instances as a defense to disprove the theory of decay? Again, I don't think that is responsive. I think you can make the argument that it's not enough for them to do that. The argument about, like, even if they're right, that things have changed in the past, they have to win why the affirmative will result in things that change, right? I think this makes more sense in the context of like a really big stick AF, right? They're like, prevent nuclear war because progress can happen in the future. Here are a bunch of examples, right? The idea that they hold out in front of you that there are instances of progress that can happen in the future, but will never defend why they are an instance of that progress is an instantiation of cruel optimism, right? They dangle freedom in front of you like, here, come get it, but will never actually actualize it. Right, the past examples are not the plan, is basically the argument. If that makes sense, yeah. Cool. Questions, comments, thoughts? I think stuff you might want to know about a little bit more is the libidinal economy. I think most teams just respond to it with psychoanalysis, non-falsifiable, because they assume you're using a purely like Freudian, Lacanian theorization of the libidinal economy. But I think our sort of discussion of grammar above, A, provides empirics for that, but B, is grounded in behavioral psychology, which I think is distinct from psychoanalysis. So although your author has psychoanalytic tendencies, the use of behavioral psychology proves your argument. I also think you can have a critique of Western rationality about what is viewed as science / what is not. Falsifiability is probably not a reason to reject Afropessimism or dismiss their thoughts, because in academic spaces, people that want to do research into this are obviously casted out of the academy because they're not viewed as, worthy academic endeavors because of the sort of way that like tropes have been casted upon bodies. Nora, Hari, Tanish, Adarsh, Yusuf, Mr. Woodhead even, or Elmer even, any other stuff you want me to go over about Afropessimism stuff? Oh, yeah. So I think there's a really good thing there's a really good article from Nyong'o. I'm still waiting for the book, but once I find it, I can send it to you. It's basically articulating that in the academy, blackness is sort of relegated to blackness is relegated to the outside of blackness is relegated as unacademic, sort of professional, and not worthy of academic endeavors, which then shapes the way that science breaks out, because science is then only controlled from a normative white perspective. So obviously, we cannot have a sort of robust understanding of the way that Blackness operates on a libidinal level. Well, there's no incentive for scientists in academia to research those things, right? Black people engaging in academia are delegitimized and not viewed as correct enough or smart enough, which is why a lot of their projects into things such as libidinality, etc., have been denied. I think Christina Sharp also talks about this in her book In the Wake, when she's like, we need to create new forms of Blackened knowledge that exist outside of the academy and outside of the confines of normative understandings of what is science / what is education, because we have never been afforded those same things because we've had to assimilate to the demands of the university. Yeah, so Sandy, the Cikara Van Bavel stuff and the neurological biases malleable stuff, I think we have made that argument above, right? About if we are right that the world is structured via grammar, then it could be true that neurological bias is malleable. But that doesn't disprove your argument about the libidinal economy, but rather proves solvency for why a break in the grammatical repetition of anti-Blackness is good. Secondly, I think that if you read the Cikara Van Bavel study, Elmer has this card that he helped me out with. It's that the thesis of the card is mostly in the context of, red and blue dots and Democratic versus Republicans. But when you look into the only study about Black folks, it utilizes what is known as the contact hypothesis, and actually came to the conclusion that it resulted in net worse forms of anti-Black violence each and every instance of it. The card said that the amygdala response stuff was like very shady, because it's like, yeah, that was the first response, but if you look at the impact of that over a history of time, it's resulted in more anti-Blackness, which is then an indict of the Cikara Van Bavel stuff. Yeah, Sandy, just search up stuff that's like contact hypothesis wrong, and that should be like give you some good stuff against it. Contact hypothesis wrong. And Elmer, I don't know if you have the side of the card on you. You can, if you want, you can paste it in the chat. Cool. How about Tanish and Yusuf? I'm interested in hearing some of your thoughts. I know we've had some discussions about abolitionism, but do you kind of see a little bit of a difference between abolitionism and Afropessimism, and thoughts on the difference? Honestly, I just want to sort of open up a sort of discussion about Afropessimism, because obviously it's not the only sort of writings of Black radicals, but it is one of the most influential ones. How would Afropessimism interact with settler colonialism? Yeah, that's a great question. I think the person you want to start reading for this stuff is Tiffany King. Tiffany King probably has some of the most, like, the best stuff about the intersection between the two. But I can give you some examples. So first would be why settler colonialism cannot encompass Blackness, or cannot encompass the theory of anti-Blackness, but rather co-constitutive of one another. The argument that Tiffany King makes, and she cites an example of a plantation in Diamond Hill, is that settlers have sort of an origin point, right? They have a relationship to land, but the difference is that Blackness does not have that sort of originary relationship to land because of the natal alienation stuff we talked about above. So the intersection between the two is that there is both a clearing and entrance of commodities, where native folks have to be cleared from the land in order to bring black folks onto it as commodities. I think Tiffany King also has some interesting stuff about the ways that that native folks are also complicit in the system of anti-blackness because of the Diamond Hill stuff I hinted to above about basically that there were a slave plantation owned by indigenous folks in order to make themselves seem more white or to seem more civil or to fall in less degrees of deviancy on the sort of graph we constructed earlier. So like when we went back to the graph that we started this conversation about, and we put blackness as the sort of origin point, native folks would try to distance themselves away from that origin by owning slaves, by pretending to assimilate and become like the white man. And I think Chow also talks about it in the context of mimesis, but I definitely think Tiffany King should be the first person you read on that. And all right, see you, Sandy. Yeah, this was fun. And yeah. Adios. Tanish, it looked like you were saying something, but I didn't see you finish it. It said, I get the gist of it. I get the basic idea, but if you want to complete that, we can probably go into a little bit more depth on what you're confused about still. Yeah, no worry, Mr. Woodhead. I have the first part recorded. This is like the second Zoom call that I'll add on. Hey, thanks, Elmer. I'll send that to Sandy when I after the Zoom call. But Tanish, so you saw the King card that was like the politics of immigration operates through the discourse of criminology that's dependent on the ontological position of blackness. Oh, yeah. So I can talk about this a bit, and if Elmer wants to chime in, he can too. But the King 19 card that I was reading on that stuff was twofold. One, it says the idea of what is a citizen / who is included in the nation state is always an objection to blackness because black folks are never actually viewed as what is a proper citizen. Secondly, it's about the idea of incarceration and why they're detained. It's because the idea of immigrants being dirty, deviants, criminals, thief, etc., is only understood because of their degrees of deviancy in relationship to blackness. So the ontological positioning of blackness provides a conceptual grammar for understanding why immigrants face such rampant discrimination, etc. It's a question of, so if we go back to the sort of graph thing again, which I think is probably the most important analogy to understand how all of this functions, it says the way that sort of identity gets cohered upon others is through an extension of blackness onto others. And in degrees of acceptance and rejection of that describes how they get carceralized. If that makes sense. I know I use a bunch of big words, but that's sort of the argument that King is making. Does Afropessimism advocate for nihilism? Interesting question. So, yes and no. I want to be hesitant here because the way that people normatively interpret nihilism is different from the way that Afropessimists and like people like Nietzsche interpret nihilism. So I'll start from Warren. Warren advocates for a strategy of black nihilism. The argument that he's making is that black folks should sort of abdicate hope in the political and sort of reject all of that and instead focus on how to cultivate new modes of spiritual care and like community outside of the political. So I think that is what Nietzsche kind of refers to as active nihilism, right? Active nihilism is the idea that if the world is like problematic and if the world is rooted in violent structures, do you either be be a passive nihilist who worries about it and tries to solve everything, but rather gets caught up in the project of resentment, or are you the active nihilist that sort of accepts that the world is problematic and structured in this anti-black measure, but focus on how to build communities of care, self-care, and create modes of social life within social death? I know we didn't go into social death, but basically, I'm not going to explain it here. I don't have nearly enough time, but it's the idea that like the absence of an ontological condition of blackness means that then they are not viewed as human and already in a process of social death, which are structured to the gratuity we talked about, uh, the native alienation we talked about, and general dishonorment, which is just our argument about why they're time and time again viewed as inferior. Um, so yes, nihilism in the sense that it says reject the political, but no nihilism in the fact that it says throw your hands up, the world's anti-black, do nothing. Um, so we have 8 more minutes. If anyone has any other questions, comments, concerns, we can. I'm more than happy to answer them now. How do you think Afropessimism would interact with Baudrillard on the level of reality versus simulation, and like Bataille, and the gratuitous violence being key to the general economy? Huh. So for the stuff on Baudrillard, I guess I guess the whole stuff about grammar and fungibility would be an impact turn to Baudrillard, right? Well, I could see it both ways. I could see some Baudrillardian authors being like, if grammar is the problem, we mess up the grammar and we are able to challenge that system. I think that's what Gillespie makes in their sort of black nihilism argument about challenging and rupturing systems of grammars through black terrorism. But I think that 101 Baudrillard sort of falls victim to just being another rearrangement of signs and symbols, which then means that they rely on the same sort of objection of blackness in order to cohere what their politics is, right? If we are right about this critique of grammar and critique of the way that words sort of shape reality, then Baudrillard's argument about sort of the overproliferation of words and the overproliferation of signs, and as those things being vacuous, disavows the ontological position of blackness. Bataille, gratuitous violence being key to the general economy. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't read much Bataille besides for the stuff that I worked with on with Wilmo and James Mollison over summer. But the stuff that I did get was the way that I would phrase it is like this, right? That the understanding of the general economy is problematic when blackness precedes sort of the political and general economy, right? It's not that blackness is viewed as abject just because of capital, etc., but rather that there's a libidinal coding that we talked about via the process of grammar that Bataille would never be able to understand, right? That a focus on productive versus unproductive expenditure and the utilization of economics, etc., does not understand the sort of libidinal nature of blackness, which then gives you access to all of the sort of critiques of cool optimism, etc., that we have done above. I don't know if that. Okay, cool. Let me think. What else about Baudrillard? Yeah, I had some thoughts about this. Let me see if I have. Anyone else have questions? Otherwise, I can do some more stuff on this Baudrillard stuff. Cool. Let me just pull up the Baudrillard stuff real quick. Okay, so here's some more of the Baudrillard stuff I have. First is on the idea of sort of deterritorialization / the becoming stuff that they have the overlap with Deleuze on. The ability to conceptualize the world outside of the current ethical code is a move to recreate systems of settler expansion as well as anti-blackness, because it is built through the categories of genocide and slavery. To death map that structures blackness as well as indigeneity are the backbone of any sort of postmodern project. The move to construct a new sort of ethical world is bad because world making has never been a good thing in the context of conquest and slavery. It's not ending violence, but rather is a reincorporation of violence under a new name. So that'd be a sort of critique of futurity that I'd have. Second would be a fluidity link. Fluidity is the move of the settler to be the future themselves. They're always malleable, always able to overcome structures and be structures themselves based on the moment. You are the future writing yourself into existence, territorialization of identity and subjectivity that needs to be unlocked. The moment of recognition makes a distinction of what does and does not occupy that relation and results in counter definitions of staticity. The move to make themselves innocent and endless frontiers results in a self-actualization, which is bad because it results in a God complex. The last thing I'd probably put on this Baudrillard stuff and the linguistic stuff is a transubstantiation argument. The one I see at best is a move to repentance that results in innocence. The settlers thinks that when they repent through categories of things it's produced, categories of things it has produced requires remaking of culture in the image of the native, in the image of the slave. If genocide and slavery are initial encounters, it's the birthplace of transgression, and then blackness and indigeneity are then are on the cross and sacrificed for your own redemption, which I think then makes sense because of, especially with Baudrillard's sort of intersection with settler colonialism and theories of blackness. It makes sense that he's always sort of has this fetishistic attachment onto the idea of slavery and really does put blackness and indigeneity on a cross to be sacrificed for his own redemptive project, because the only time he included that was after he got called out by Black and indigenous authors for being too whitewashed. If that makes sense, Darsh, hopefully. Cool. So we have less than a minute now. So I want to just thank everyone for coming on the call, donating, and doing your job. It's really important that we help those on the front lines now. And I plan on doing more lectures like this. So if any of y'all have a lecture y'all want me to do next, feel free to email me, text me, Slack me, and let's see if we can do another one of these soon. Thank y'all for coming.
Thank you.